Good evening. It is Dan Kerr's DK Analytics. It is April 22nd, 2018. We're back in a video format. We, in essence, want to review certain aspects of post number 37, where we delve into the truly mountainous or perpetually mounting political risks, economic risks, and financial risks, both a national, that is United States, domestic, and on a global stage, and how this is juxtaposed against pretty much across the board global asset bubbles, most especially in tremendously overvalued bonds, and also stocks, and the two are tied at the hip as we've reviewed. And this dichotomy is both a risk, as we continue to say, much like a broken record. I apologize, but it is what it is. And I think this is a unique opportunity for strategic investors to reposition themselves or reduce vulnerability to what must come. It's not a question of if, it's only a question of when. But the state of politics, and I really go into this in post 37 and also in post 35, the state of politics in the United States, when looked at in terms of the federal government, I mean, the political risks here of a rogue government, of, in essence, a largely criminal enterprise called the U.S. government, it's sad to say, but it is that way, is at some point going to combine with either economic or financial risks that manifest themselves, will combine to take away confidence. And oftentimes like a hockey stick, it takes a while to break, and then all of a sudden everybody runs for the hills. The emperor has no clothes. It takes a 5-year-old boy to call it out, and everybody finally accepts and then starts to act on what they know and their gut is going on but refuse to face, or there were algos that were conditioned to keep buying when things are going up that will reverse on the downside and keep selling as things go down. So we have no rhyme or reason in things. We're far away from sanity, common sense, price discovery, the rule of law, as I'm going to go into. And frankly, it's not a pretty picture. I don't want to state this in a pessimistic way. I just am trying to state it in a realistic way, in an honest way, as best as I can ascertain it, with the help of many people that I communicate with, my own ability to decipher things, hopefully in an adult, mature, sensible way, and then draw some conclusions from it. In this case, as regards portfolio allocation suggestions. But if we look at what's been going on with this rogue Mueller special counsel, which is appointed by, unfortunately, the Trump Justice Department, this guy has been on a witch hunt against the Trump, in essence, campaign, which didn't control the instrumentalities of power, and also in terms of potential Russian election interference. That was the Obama administration and the big players in it. And that is really what is never examined, and other things, which is what makes this entire thing so damn criminal, i.e. unconstitutional, amoral, and against any kind of credibility, which is key for confidence, which in turn underpins asset values, especially when both finances and economics are wanting in terms of rationalizing such outrageous valuations. Then it hangs on a credibility thread or a central bank put thread. I'll get into that in a second. You're all familiar with that. But let's look at some of the things here. I would say that in the U.S., and unfortunately to a large degree around the world, we don't have representative governments. We don't have governments that are actually making policy within the constraints of protecting the true sovereigns, the citizens of those nations. They appear to all be on a war path to go in the other direction, which is handing over the keys of the kingdom, if you will, to illegal aliens or immigrants from the third world in such huge numbers that it threatens to topple the very things that made these Western countries attractive bastions of freedom and of property rights and of tolerance in the first place. But I mean, in the United States, both sides of the aisle, both the Democrats and the Republicans, with few exceptions, only on the Republican side, are actually kleptocrats. They're thieves. If you think I'm going too far, just think of this. Obamacare was supposed to be repealed by the Republicans. They promised it all over and over again in the 2016 election. People running for Congress to the president, and it hasn't been taken out, only for individual mandates, which is the smallest portion of it. But guess who's exempted from it all? The federal government. That is the entire Congress and other people. And their exemption is based upon them claiming a small business exemption, which means 50 or under 50 employees. This is how this sausage factory works. They institute laws which wreck Obamacare, families' finances, reduce health care coverage, cause misery, and they promptly exempt themselves under a small business exemption. There are 2 million bureaucrats in D.C., and their staffers in Congress number in the thousands, so go figure. But this is what I'm talking about. They're kleptocrats. They're not obeying the Constitution. They're not moral. They're not ethical. And that's the problem. When you lack ethics and morality in your leaders, then how can you hope to enforce the rule of law? Speaking of which, Mueller has been on this witch hunt against Trump, former campaign Trump, when not only did they not control the instrumentalities of power with regard to having any ability to steer Russian election interference, which is a fabrication other than what the Democrats were engaged in, led by Hillary Clinton. They're going to continue, like with Michael Flynn, to, in essence, proceed in a mobster-like fashion to find anything, let's say a testimony that is incorrect or based on memory or a process, or they're going to come up with things such as process crimes that they're going to try to throw at the Trump administration or the Trump campaign, or call it obstruction of justice. Mueller has been digging with 16 Democratic hacks that all want to torpedo, or reverse the election decision. They have been going at this, turning everything upside down, arresting people, coming into their condominiums in the middle of the night, and as if they were, cold-blooded murderers or God knows what. And this is how the left operates. And these mobster tactics, unfortunately, continue to proceed because the Justice Department under Jeff Sessions, what a disappointment this man is, or Rosenstein, won't rein in Mueller's special counsel, which is nothing other than a counsel that is trying to put together an impeachment against Trump based upon charges which don't stick, which are meritless. Again, there is no Trump campaign-based Russian collusion. They haven't found a thing in over a year and a quarter. But that's not going to stop them, and that's the problem. They're not going to get stopped because the Republicans are sadly complicit in this as well. But I'll get to that in a second. Let me just highlight a few of the points, all right? We've got Mueller, who's into this Russian election interference, who at the same time refuses to look into or investigate with his powerful crew of Democratic lawyers, obviously very political, right? But they won't look into the abundance of evidence about Hillary Clinton collusion with the Russians, that Hillary Clinton paid for a warrant to look into Trump campaign to surveil them, okay, illegally. I'll get into the Fourth Amendment violation. We've got humongous Clinton charity fraud, foundation fraud as proof. I mean, there are all these would-be felonies, potential felony, smoking guns surrounding the Democrats concerning the 2016 election and well before and to this day, right? You've got the Clinton collusion with the Russians. For details, please see Post 37 with links that'll let you look until you're ready to, to throw up, actually. You've got the humongous Clinton Foundation fraud. You've got, get this, massive FBI coordinated destruction of evidence / obstruction of justice. Hillary Clinton's homebrew server and all the emails and all the Russian stuff, including the uranium sales and her charity foundation, charity fraud, all these things were whitewashed by none other than the FBI. All right. This goes all the way back to the Benghazi attacks in 2012, the U.S. Embassy, where Clinton fingered and the Department of State fingered a Californian native for creating an incendiary video that caused this, threw him in jail for a year, ruined his life, and none of it proved to be true. And here is Hillary walking scot-free. She is an unconvicted felon, and so are lots of people at the top of the FBI, right? And those that are still there are those that have left, from McCabe to Comey, to Mueller, who's conducting this special counsel, this witch hunt. But we've got, on top of that, Mueller's unwillingness to look into gross negligence by Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State, regarding the classified information, which again was placed, a substantial part of it, on her server, where the FBI whitewashed something like 10 to 30,000 emails. All right, I mean, this is Banana Republic crap. It really is. It's a disgrace. It's a disgrace. And the email server issue, all right, was conducted with the de facto go-ahead of the Obama administration, of President Obama, and lots of bad actors. Is any of this ever investigated? No. Instead, we hark back to the day on June 14th. I think it was June 14th. Check out Post 35 if you're interested. It's at the bottom, the second last paragraph, Comey, 14-minute mark. There's a link. And what Comey, in essence, did in that frightful summer, where you knew as an American citizen that there was no more rule of law in this country because the mighties were above the law, all right? Which means you can't have rule of law. Then you have tyranny, you have a dictatorship. That is the vital aspect of any rule of law. It has to apply to everyone, regardless of your station. And clearly it did not apply to Hillary Clinton or the Obama administration or the people that headed up the DOJ, the Department of Justice, which frankly was more of a Department of Injustice than a Department of Justice, whether it was under Holder or under Lynch. This whole, tyrannical cabal has done a hell of a lot to really put America on a low water mark concerning its adherence to the rule of law. Again, there's no effort by Mueller's hack crew, his special counsel, to investigate multiple signs of abuses by the federal government, by the Department of Justice hoodwinking the FBI into surveillance powers, whether it's the FISA court. We're referring to wanton and criminal investigations of Americans' invasions, massive invasions of privacy for political reasons that make a mockery of the protections that the Fourth Amendment provides, and thus the Constitution, and thus the people in power, in a very broad sense, call it a conspiracy, because that's what it is, that have been tied up in all of this, right? Yet Mueller, with a very checkered history as FBI head for 8-9 years, he oversaw the anthrax threats, where he fingered a doctor that had nothing to do with it and ruined his life and his finances and his family. Whether it's the Tea Party IRS scandal, where he was at the FBI helm, where people were targeted, constitutionalists, and pasted by IRS threats and worse, and he won't look into any of that. That was under his watch, and much, much more. And he has wide Democratic backing, as you can imagine. But you know what's really hairy, it's really scary, is the Republicans are also ready to rally to Mueller's cause. Hands off, they're telling President Trump. Don't fire the guy that you could because he's domiciled in the executive branch. Donald Trump can fire anybody in the executive branch, at least at the appointed level that or people he appointed. Career bureaucrats are more difficult to get out, but this even has Republican backing. In other words, that Mueller should sustain a witch hunt or offshoots thereof to drag the Trump administration into the mud, to keep it from doing its executive task, and thus, weary the people out to such a degree that you know what propaganda is, right? If you tell a lie often enough, that if the press or the mainstream media keep pushing this out relentlessly, and they are all Democratic hacks,
that's just a fact. Sorry, but it's true. Then people will begin to believe that the Trump administration is guilty as far as Russian collusion, which again is an absolute joke. But the Republicans, right, they're supposed to support Trump, are even rallying together with the Democrats to put together a Mueller protection bill, which they, as the legislative branch, have no legal standing to do. It's the prerogative of the president to hire and fire people in the executive branch, and this includes the special prosecutor, right? But the Republicans are rallying together with Democrats to prevent this guy from carrying out this absolute political campaign that is disingenuous, dishonest, and also blatantly ignores the humongous felonies committed by members of the Obama administration that preceded the Trump administration. And what is the reason for this, right? What is the reason for this? That's that the Republicans are backing Mueller, who really is a piece of work. The reason is that the GOP isn't so grand anymore, and the Democrats really are one and the same party. Think back to Obamacare and the exclusion. It isn't only exclusion that they have to a law that's turned so many Americans' lives upside down, reduced care, people dying on the vine, and all kinds of really nasty stuff. But they exempt themselves from a lot of laws and regulations that ordinary people have to live by or live under, which again is the definition of lawlessness. My point is this: neither the crony Republicans or the leftist Marxist Democrats want to give up the power that Washington, D.C. has grabbed onto itself, in essence supported and floated and financed by the printing press in an ever more outrageous fashion since 1971. So they'd rather sustain the swamp. Both the Democrats and the Republicans, they're in bed together, one from a Marxist perspective, one from a crony perspective, but they want to continue to eviscerate rights and property of average Americans to consolidate even more power and wealth onto themselves. What is that other than a dictatorship at the end of the day? Nothing. And that's the point, right? But we can't return to the rule of law unless people that control the instrumentalities of power, that take an oath to uphold the Constitution, which is the rule of law at the very highest level, if they don't uphold it, their oaths, then we don't have rule of law, regardless of the constitutional protections that the sovereigns, the citizens, are supposed to have. Speaking of rule of law infidelity, the FBI, this is just Mickey Mouse stuff. This is mobster stuff. Raiding Trump's attorney's office, again early in the morning, it intrudes in a very, very dangerous, again lawless manner into privileged communication protections between a lawyer and his client. And it violates or potentially violates various aspects of the Fourth, the Fifth, and the Sixth Amendments. The Fourth Amendment, people have the right to be secure in their persons, homes, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. We've seen that with Flynn. We've seen it now we saw it with Manafort. We're going to see it now with Trump's personal lawyer, who's very close to everything he's done, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But if this is done against the Fourth Amendment, then any evidence collected is inadmissible because you've violated the Constitution. All right. The Fifth Amendment, no defendant or by extension counsel is going to be forced to what? To be a witness against himself. The Sixth Amendment, another potential violation, the right to counsel and the privacy of the lawyer-client relationship. And if you tie these together, the stunts that the FBI pulled in the Southern District of New York is another example of rank violation by the alt media, of which I'm obviously a part. That over 4,000 executive
sealed indictments that have been put together, which is up, oh my God, I don't know, from about 900 before Trump took office, that they will be unsealed and arrests will be made. And in the process, people that are abusing the law, that have powerful positions, either elected officials or bureaucrats in our bureaucratic overkill, that hope springs eternal that these felonious indictments or people that have committed serious crimes within the federal government, wherever they sit in the nation, will be unsealed with increasing frequency as the 18 election draws. Moreover, that once unleashed, such a process won't be derailed, and increasingly large swaths of the federal ruling elite in D.C. or wherever they sit at the federal level throughout the country will be implicated and charged with crimes. Right? Such a cleansing would go a long way to purging the kleptocratic and bureaucratic lawlessness that pervades from unconstitutional legislation, which in essence the executive branch makes, followed by property rights eviscerating extortion that occurs through, in essence, the regulatory agencies, especially the EPA and the lifelong bureaucrats that feed off of this. We've got such a widespread, such an intimidating set of regulations that in essence amount to laws that anything you do can be written up against you, and in worst case you can be thrown in the slammer. So we're going up against an absolute arsenal of potential violations that totally strips the basic rights assured citizens by the Constitution, most especially including the Bill of Rights, where property right protections also abound, and legislation made through the legislative chamber, not through the executive bureaucratic set of characters that number 2 million in the United States, right? But if we now take a look at this in a hopeful sense, and we think of something, and it is this. I'm not so hopeful. Why? Because in essence, the vested interests, just take a look at the Republicans wanting to protect Mueller. Take a look at the Mitch McConnell cronyism, the Paul Ryan amnesty furthering, and the lies. These people are afraid of being implicated. They don't want the swamp to be drained.
And as a result, neither do the sheltered bureaucrats, that number 2 million, that get above private sector pay. They have gold-plated defined benefit plans. They don't want to rock the boat, right? Collectively speaking. So not as hopeful. And again, as I've said once before, if there are people that take their oath to support and uphold the Constitution, something I had to do in Lee County, Florida as a substitute teacher, by the way, all right? But I mean it. I'll do it, even if the mighty mucks in D.C. and elsewhere won't. These people have a conflict of interest. I call it a conspiracy, namely their pay, their pensions, their above private sector pay, their gold-plated pensions are at risk, and they know it. So they will protect the criminal heads of departments, because to be a whistleblower would, given the unbelievable criminality in all these departments near the top and elsewhere, would push them out the window and take away their pensions and their high-paying jobs. So this to me is a conspiracy, a broad daylight conspiracy. It's so obvious, and I think the alt media people are neglecting to look at this. And I think that is very sobering in terms of turning the good ship around. And again, I ask, how many people, after all the FBI abuses, after the Tea Party abuses that are in these agencies, after the IRS abuses against the Tea Party, people that should stand for the Constitution and the oath they took and the survival of America as a constitutional republic, how many of them stood up, raised their hands, and took advantage of the Whistleblower Protection Act for the sake of their country and their future? Hardly anybody. And I just said, why? Now, there is one positive, and the positive aspect is that once the Republicans grow a set, if some of them do, and there's some hopeful signs, and they indict one, then we might have a round of plea bargaining, such as currently Comey, right, and the former Attorney General Lynch, that they are starting to chase each other's tails, and if they can get some dirt on somebody and they have to state what the other criminal top dog did, then they're going to look for plea bargains to minimize their sentences, and this could blow the whole thing wide open, but certainly not based on the other factors. Well, President Trump's our economic issue, and I'll wrap up with this. I think this is at this point much more a political tinderbox and confidence that somehow, think about this. If people invest in the United States in securities, whether they're domestic people, whether they're, pension funds, whether they're overseas creditors, which have lent America more than enough rope to hang itself with, over $8 trillion and counting, trade deficit $600 billion net. We have a situation where confidence that America is not just a banana republic, in terms of the rule of law being an absolute joke because the mighty do whatever they want. That's a very fragile thing. And God knows there's enough economic and financial risks out there, and not just in the United States, but around the world. And again, juxtaposed against assets priced for perfection and beyond. That's the disconnect, right? If stocks are yielding 6 times earnings and bonds are paying you 8 to 10 or 12%, a 10-year treasury, then you could say, look, I've got risk compensation galore. The end of the world is not nigh, and this is a good risk-return trade-off, especially when everybody is negative. But that hasn't manifested itself. The central bank put is still in place, and the bond vigilantes haven't come out, despite our massive debt load of over $237 trillion last count. They haven't come out, globally speaking, about $68 trillion in the United States. The bond vigilantes, if they smell or if they sense that the central banks, led by the Fed and perhaps later the ECB, are really going to start to sell some of their bonds and pull the plug a bit on this toxic public policy stew. At the same time, as we're so late in a fake economic recovery, we're losing productivity, we're losing property right protections. In other words, we're losing free market capitalism, right? I mean, if they sense that the Fed is serious and they haven't been, they've been letting bonds expire, right? That's the first step. They haven't, in other words, they've collected money and the money, poof, disappears when a bond matures. But if this extends to outright going and selling existing bonds in their portfolio, this will ratchet it up, and they threaten up to $600 billion. And I've said before that the U.S. could easily require $1.8 trillion, given the size of the deficit, currently $1.2 trillion and expanding. It'd be much bigger in an economic recession, an official one, less taxes collected, more transfer payments during a recession. So America could be looking to, to fund $2 trillion or $3 trillion. Now, if you have part of that being a $600 billion bond sale by the Fed, QT, quantitative tightening instead of quantitative easing, then someone's going to figure out pretty soon that this huge supply of bonds onto the marketplace is going to drive prices of bonds down or yields up. And those smart investors, the bond vigilantes, will want to front run that trade, right? And this is what we're looking at. We have various statistics, economic statistics, that point to weakness, whether it's a rapidly increasing Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection rate that firms are seeking in the U.S. It's imposed 37, whether it's full-time jobs being down 300,000 plus, according to shadowstats.com, whether it's German industrial orders turning around month over month at the highest rate in something like 9-10 years, whether it's Hong Kong Hong Kong real estate issues with interest rates there starting to perk up, whether it's the LIBOR, where much of the world's financing is done at the London interbank offering rate, that's heading up smartly. So we've got this confluence of tightening liquidity or heightened interbank trust or issues with banks no longer believing their own balance sheets, that a lot of that can be tied in possibly to the fact that there are over $410 trillion of off-balance sheet, over-the-counter, non-exchange traded interest rate derivatives out there, right? That in essence are bets by money center banks that interest rates will stay low. If we get interest rates perking up, it'll be not because of robust economic activity, but it will be because of increasing solvency / monetary inflation concerns. That is, the central banks and the Keynesians running this will double down on the insanity called QE to protect their progeny, bubble stocks and bonds, and to keep the whole system afloat from imploding on itself. And this will then, in essence, usher in a de facto currency debasement default, where the purchasing power of those bonds and the currencies in which they're bought are going to be laid to waste. So if you take a look at our impasse from mounting economic signals across the world of weakness, whether you take a look at finances, the factors I just mentioned, plus the fact that the world is $237 trillion in debt, up about 9-10%. Our debt to GDP globally and domestically have been increasing. We're globally at 3.1 times global GDP, an unprecedented level, yet we're losing productivity and property right protections. We're losing price discovery. We've lost it, right? They're all manipulated markets. But man, when this sucker turns, it's really going to turn. I'm talking about a return beyond, a reversion beyond the mean that's going to be given more impetus by the sorry state of affairs that we have been steering into. So I would say on the interest rate sensitivity front, bond vigilantes will at first try to front run any QT or bond sales by central banks, and if that doesn't work and they quickly have to resort to QE, which I think they will very quickly actually, then they will also sell because of currency debasement risk. So it's either front running higher interest rates or selling because of the inevitable destruction of currencies, where the bonds paid back at some point could be worth a piece of toilet paper, right? And both those things augur negatively for the bond market, and by extension, as I've said numerous times, equity valuations which are attached to the discount rate, which is based upon the bond yield with a premium for equities, given that shareholders are last in line in terms of any scraps flowing to the bottom line. And these things will metastasize or come together at a point, and we don't know what the trigger is, and I don't know to what degree we can avoid either a trade war or an active war. I put into Post 35 an interesting link from the Federalist, which talks about what I know and anyone living in the United States knows, this increasing disenchantment between the red states and the blue states, between leftists and constitutionalists, and that a divorce might be necessary. We've obviously got a refugee crisis in Europe of untold proportions, largely due to endless American meddling in the Middle East and bombing of infrastructure and sending people into flight. And the closest geography is obviously Europe, but we don't have European leaders protecting their own citizens against this. So the whole thing is kind of pretty nasty, especially if we're losing productivity. And on that front, we have Moore's Law starting to come apart. And if we have energy issues to compound it, we might well be, together with aging societies, even more payouts to aging baby boomers such as myself. Then we really have a toxic public policy stew that will reverberate in terms of extracting a pound of flesh by investors wanting much higher risk compensation for their bonds and stocks, meaning much lower bond prices, much lower yields, much higher yields, much lower PEs, much higher earnings yields, and dividend yields. And this is in the pipeline. This is unavoidable. And the politics, which have gotten so sloppy, so unconstitutional, so lawless, might be the straw that breaks the camel's back if economics or finances don't, if a trade war or a hot war don't. And we can look at these investments down the road once these things have occurred, and everybody is negative as can be. Those will be buying days. Today are selling days for bonds and stocks. And I'd also draw to your attention, also sound like a broken record here, that physical gold and silver are pulled out of the ground at a rate which increases the supply by about 1 or 2%. The silver that's mined is about 16 billion a year. The gold that's mined, again at current gold and silver prices, is about 140 billion a year. The supply of above ground gold and silver in aggregate goes up thanks to mining by only 1 or 2%, which, by the way, is a great surrogate for sustainable real economic growth, about 1% population, 1% productivity. It's the ultimate monetary aggregate, right? Especially if you use it instead of bonds as your monetary base and then let the multiplier do its thing. But you have a stable value, not a debt instrument as the basis for your monetary base and thus your money supply. That's what's wrong with all this, and it begets even more debt. But note, if you will, as a closing thought, the assets under management, investable, liquid assets, are estimated to be something like 280 trillion, right? And about, I think, 70 trillion of that is managed. But we're talking, in essence, bonds, about 2/3 bonds of all sorts, and stocks. Now, compare that with a gold or precious metals exposure of investable assets, again, totaling roughly 280 trillion globally, of about 1% or less. If the whole globe, that is, people both from professional money managers to mom and pops and others, or small accounts, are convinced that we're going to be down for the count because of negative price action in stocks and bonds. And remember, once this thing breaks to the downside, it's going to take on momentum of its own, whether it's the computer programs, the algorithms, which will see a lower price as bad and keep selling, and will go on into the other extreme. This will be aped by Main Street, obviously, unfortunately, that most of which won't get out in time. But as they go through this, and we also realize that not only are governments bankrupt, but pension funds are bankrupt, whether private or public, and that we need to get the printing presses, back up on their feet at warp speed or like never before, then this whole thing can cascade down. And if people then decide that they want to own not paper gold, right, but real gold, and they'll find a way to change their articles of incorporation. But even if they don't, there's so little of it. Again, compare 13, 14 billion of silver mined a year and 130 to 140 billion of gold mined a year, and consider the above ground supply that expands based upon that mine production or mining extraction by 1 or 2%. And furthermore, consider that a lot of that silver is in junkyards and old electronics, computers, iPhones, what have you, that is not economic to recycle unless the silver price were manyfold what it is today. Think that gold, while much more easy to access, is increasingly firm hands in the East, whether it's Russia, China, India, Indonesia, Turkey, what have you, people that know that precious metals are real money. They're not going to sell at these prices. They've been buying because they know that paper money goes to hell. History tells them. They know it. The West has forgotten it, but the East knows it. And so what you have is a situation where, just say a doubling of the gold and silver exposure, really gold because silver is a rounding error, would require something like 10 years of mining production, right? So the only way you're going to get people that are pretty sticky holders at this point, very sticky, to part is with a substantially higher gold or silver price. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the opportunity. And this is an opportunity that Main Street can use very well, especially with silver, because you can buy it, it's unloved, it's unwanted. The spread between spot and what it'll cost you to get it from a reputable dealer is as low as it's been in a long time. The absolute price of these assets are very low. And if we went back to some kind of gold-based monetary standard and say we were able to back 40, 50% of the world's money supply, call it M1 or possibly M2, with gold, we could do that, but only with a gold price that would be roughly 12, 13 times today's level. And that's happened before, could happen again, but even if it doesn't, people are going to run for the hills, and they're going to want assets not just in the East but in the West, which are real money and not just debt. And this is my pitch, once again, for adding some physical silver and gold outside of banks. Keep it your own safe someplace outside of banks because it will be bailed in an emergency, and that will help offset a lot of the carnage. And while you do that, again, also a repeat, consider placing more of your stock and bonds, selling them, because if you have bonds and stocks, you don't have cash. If you have bonds and stocks, right? And the price can gap down like in 87 by 20% overnight. If you have cash in a bank, you no longer have cash anymore either. 99% has been lent out, and there are bail-in laws, so good luck with that. If you really want cash or cash surrogate, get a 1 or 2 or 3 month treasury And that is something that the government can print to make you whole. They're not going to attack that. They're not going to bail that in because that would be cutting off their noses to spite their face. So those are some parting thoughts. Hope this makes some sense. Encourage you to look at Post 35 and 37. They go together. We talk about how politics might be what kills the confidence. Thanks a lot for listening. Bye-bye.